let's start with the Portman Sinema bill.
So, I mean, that is largely focused on so-called hard infrastructure, on built environment kind of stuff. So you have your roads and bridges. There's a decent amount of money for broadband, for public transit and Amtrak, and there's some remediation stuff, which is largely capping orphan oil and gas wells and increasing Superfund cleanup. So that's sort of environmental pollution based. There's a lot of money for resiliency. It just says resiliency. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go, but I presume that we're talking about money for seawalls for maybe New York, maybe Miami, things of that nature. And so you put that together. I mean, there's some money for the electric grid. I think climate advocates were very concerned that there wasn't a whole lot for climate in the bipartisan bill, and that since this other bill looked to be very much along the lines of what Biden put out, the American Families Plan, that climate might get squeezed out. I don't think that ended up being the case, at least not in the blueprint of the budget deal. But that was sort of one of the initial concerns.
So two points to make on that bill. My understanding is that bill, if the specific line item is addressed in that bill, it will not be addressed in the reconciliation bill. So if there's $30 billion for internet or $50 billion for trains, you don't get a dollar for that. There's no supplementing that in the reconciliation bill.
Well, that is true. And I think the concern was there were a few things that you could contour and call climate legislation in Portman Sinema. And the concern was, okay, are they going to say we did climate in that other bill? That ended up not being the case. So yes, this reflects a lower level of ambition on the sort of brick and mortar kind of built environment infrastructure spending, but it was matched in the budget deal with a more expansive, in some ways, rendering of the human infrastructure elements.
So let's talk a little bit about the politics around this bill. Chuck Schumer announced, I guess yesterday, that he's going to force a test vote, maybe next Wednesday. What exactly is that test vote? And do we have a sense of, like, McConnell seems to not be sure about what to do with this on some level. And so let's talk about the dynamics there. I mean, first, let's start with the test vote. What does that mean, a test vote?
Well, it just means he's going to offer a motion to proceed onto Portman Sinema. And I think the reason that he's doing this is we got word of this agreement, I think, 3 weeks ago, and they're still working on it. And they'd probably work on it forever if a deadline wasn't put into place that said, all right, enough. You're either going to do this or not. The other thing that I think is driving this process is that the idea was, okay, we'll do the bipartisan bill, and if it falls apart, we will take those elements and we will put it into the reconciliation package. You have to know whether or not that's going to fall apart before you do a budget resolution, because there are specific top line numbers that you put into the budget resolution. So if they did Portman Sinema, that top line is 3.5 trillion in the budget resolution. If they don't do it, you have to expand that to account for this hard infrastructure stuff. So I think Schumer's idea here is that we need to know whether or not you're legitimately going forward on this. And the problem is what the problem has always been on these types of bills, and that's the revenue side. Republicans have no interest in raising taxes by one dime. They very surprisingly got through in the initial framework a increase in funding for the IRS, which would be at odds with the experience of Republicans for the last 40 years. And not surprisingly, conservatives rallied against that, and now they're backing off from including that in the package. So you take that out, and there just isn't a lot left that's available to cover a $579 billion tab. And so this, I think, is the real problem they're trying to work through, because this whole thing has been set up that $1 of spending has to be offset by $1 of revenue.
But what is that pay-go thing where $1 of spending? I mean, I understand it in the context of the reconciliation bill, because that is for that reconciliation bill to pass parliamentary muster. They have to rejigger it in a way that it makes it look like it balances out over the course of 10 years or something to that effect, right?
Well, no, it has to not add to the deficit after the 10-year window.
Okay.
I mean, we did the American Rescue Plan, which cost $1.9 trillion and had zero offsets. We did that in reconciliation, and that's because it was short-term spending that did not increase the deficit outside
of that 10-year window. And
right.
So, okay, so that's a constraint on a reconciliation bill. But is there any type of structural?
I mean, there's statutory pay-go, but you can waive that through the Budget Act. The complaint is entirely self-generated. It's the Republicans and the moderate Democrats who have put together this framework saying we don't want this to add to the deficit. So. But they don't want to take any of the steps that would have to be taken in order to actually not add to the deficit. So that's where the rubber has hit the road. It's been a problem from the very beginning on this package, and was always going to be a problem because Republicans are simply not interested in increasing taxes or in allowing taxes that are owed to be collected. So I feel like that's an intractable problem. We're going to find out the beginnings of that in a few days. And at that point, you begin to wonder, okay, was this all just a way to waste time?
And what do we know about tax increases in the reconciliation bill, right? Because we know what Biden wanted in terms of no tax increases under $400,000 and potentially capital gains. We just don't really know, though, how it's included in this reconciliation package.
Yeah, we don't have specifics. There's nods to something on corporate taxes, something on individual taxes, something on capital gains taxes. There are three sort of buckets of pay-fors in the reconciliation package, and it actually gets really interesting. So one of them is taxes. The second one is prescription drug reform, and that was not in the Biden bill. The Biden American Families Plan or the American Jobs Plan did not include prescription drug price reform, which of course, if it saves money for Medicare, is a savings to the federal government. You can use that savings to pay for this spending. So that could save as much as $500 billion or maybe even more over that 10-year window. It's a tremendous amount of money, and it creates sort of a virtuous circle because, of course, patients also pay less if the government is paying less for prescription drugs. If they're being negotiated at a rate to negotiate them down, patients will pay less too. And this is a huge initiative that Democrats have run on for like a decade, that they were going to lower the price of prescription drugs. And it creates a situation where for moderates who are worried about the cost and want to offset it, all right, here's a way to offset it, right? Lower the cost of prescription drugs. Break your association with big pharma, and you don't have to lower tax. You don't have to raise taxes as much because if the more that you get out of prescription drug price reform, the less you have to deal with on the tax side. The third bucket is even more interesting because it says long-term economic growth. And we remember this from back when the whole idea that tax cuts pay for themselves. Yeah. right? What they said was, because taxes will be cut, businesses will invest, they'll hire more people, and that tax revenue from jobs will flow into the Treasury, and that will, we don't have to pay for tax cuts because they will pay for themselves. That turned out to not be true. But Democrats are trying to use that notion, and there's a bit more plausibility to it, because if you're investing, if you're engaging in public investment in physical infrastructure or in human infrastructure, you're creating a situation where people are more educated, they can get a better job, and they can move on and increase their wage. You're increasing productivity. There are reasons, and there are economic studies that show that this will increase economic growth. So effectively what they're saying is, we're not going to pay for part of this. And they're not really saying it, but that's long-term economic growth means we're just going to go ahead and assume that we're going to have higher growth here, and that's going to cover the cost, the near-term cost of this particular spending. So the three buckets and how they play with one another are going to be very interesting as we move through the process.
I just want to jump back for a second to the bipartisan bill, this test vote. Like what just tell us, like, specifically, is this a procedural vote that basically says this bill will be brought to the floor? And so is the idea that if somebody's not going to vote for this bill, that they have to vote against it now? In other words, is it once you take this step, is it locked in that the vote itself is going to happen? Or
it's not? No. I mean, it's not locked in that you would have to vote for it on final passage.
You wouldn't have to vote for it on final passage, but the real issue is, will it pass the 60 vote or the 40 vote threshold?
I mean, you need 60 to get on the bill, right? So this is a check to see, do we have 60 votes for this bill? And do we have an actual bill? Because I mean, I think what Schumer really wants is an actual bill. So we have actual language, so they're not just dithering the entire summer away. So he is going to file cloture on it on Monday, is what he said. So I know there's been a lot of negotiations between the Democrats and Republicans who've been putting together this bill. And they'll see if they have 60. And I mean, Portman has come out, and he's the co-sponsor of it, and said, if we're not ready to go by next week, I'm going to vote no on the motion to proceed. So I think it's very unclear whether or not we'll have that, but it will be an indicator of whether or not Schumer and the Senate Democrats will need to factor in the hard infrastructure into their broader reconciliation bill.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.